we should make listed species and at-risk species an asset instead of a liability to those private landowners. Those species are there because whatever the landowner is doing is right.
Welcome back to On Land, the podcast from the Western Landowners Alliance, where we explore the people and ideas shaping the future of the American West. Today, we're talking about one of the most powerful and often polarizing conservation tools in the country, the Endangered Species Act. For over 50 years, the ESA has helped bring species like the bald eagle and black-footed ferret back from the brink. But for many private landowners, the law has also created unintended consequences, making it harder, not easier, to do the right thing for wildlife. So how do we get beyond conflict and litigation to real conservation results for species and for the people who steward the land? To help us explore that question, Lesli Allison, our CEO at Western Landowners Alliance, sits down with Leo Miranda. Leo is the Executive Director of Conservation Without Conflict and the former Southe-ast Regional Director for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's a landowner himself in Georgia. Together, they talk about how trust, transparency, and voluntary partnerships have transformed conservation in the Southeast. And they talk about what it would take to scale those solutions across the country. I'm Zach Altman, this is On Land, and here's Lesli's conversation with Leo Miranda.
Leo, welcome to the show. I'm just so delighted to have you here. And for our listeners, Leo Miranda is the Executive Director of Conservation Without Conflict, which we will talk about shortly. And he is the owner and manager of Ochile Farm in West Central Georgia. So until the end of 2022, Leo was the Southe-ast Regional Director for the Department of the Interior's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he served from 2018 to 2022. And in that capacity, he oversaw work of approximately 1,300 federal employees in carrying out the federal government's partnership role in conserving fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats within 10 southeastern states, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from the University of Puerto Rico and a Master's of Science in Zoology from North Carolina State University. So again, Leo, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lesli, so much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's really timely to have you on the show with us today. There is just so much happening with respect to conservation and the Endangered Species Act, including big changes in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, your former employer, and legislation in Congress, and a proposed rule on habitat from the Trump administration, and then today's deadline for public comment on the monarch butterfly listing. So there's a lot up when it comes to conserving wildlife and particularly threatened and endangered species. But before we get to all that, I would just love to ask you, what drew you into this field of wildlife conservation?
I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, as you know, and when I was growing up, I was in the outdoors all the time. In my family, nobody had a science background or anything dealing with conservation or wildlife, but I grew up outside, basically. When I was in high school, I was a big fan of Jacques Cousteau, the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau.
I was too.
Yeah, it was amazing. And when I was in high school, the only thing I wanted to do was going into marine biology because of that show. That was basically how I started and got into this career. I love it. Living on an island surrounded by water, obviously oceans and a lot of fish and corals and all of that. That was my only option, basically. So that's how I got into it.
Well, that's terrific. So then you ended up in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and you've had quite a journey through the Fish and Wildlife Service and then into this organization which you lead, which is Conservation Without Conflict. How did that journey come about? Tell us how that evolution took place.
Oh, it was definitely extremely interesting and exciting journey. So when I went to do my master's in North Carolina State University, go Wolfpack, I was actually hired as a student intern by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Cooperative Research Unit. This is 1991, 92 or so. And That's how I got actually exposed to Fish and Wildlife Service. It was through an internship with them. So I started to get really excited about the agency and the work they do. And when I was finishing up my degree, there was an opportunity to apply for a job actually down in Puerto Rico as a private lands biologist under the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. And that was an entry level position. I believe it was a GS5. And for those of you that don't know, in the federal careers, they go through general schedule, GS, from 1 all the way to 15. So I started as a GS5 as a private lands biologist down in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it doesn't get any better than that. Private lands biologist in the Caribbean.
So what pride do you lose from that?
And I don't know why I made some crazy changes later and ended up in Washington, D.C. after several years working down there.
You might have to have your head examined for that one, Leo.
Looking back, I think that I should have done that. So I ended up working with the same program, private lands program, but now from Washington, D.C., and ended up being the national coordinator for that program and working also with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coastal program, which is similar to Partners, but focusing on coastal environments. And after that, I did that in Washington, D.C., I don't know, 6-7 years. And I had a chance to go back to the field. I applied and got a position at the Chesapeake Bay field office in Annapolis, Maryland, dealing with habitat restoration and all the issues related to Endangered Species Act in the Washington metro area, basically, and the Chesapeake Bay. That was a fun job, beautiful place to be, a lot of working lands issues, especially in the eastern shore of Maryland, a lot of forestry, a lot of ag. And then when the big oil spill happened in the Southeast, I came to help during that oil spill.
That was the BP oil spill, right?
Correct. And so I came from Chesapeake just to help on the response. And it was funny because during that time, after a couple of months, I was acting assistant regional director for ecological services in the Southeast. And that program is the one that deals with endangered species and Endangered Species Act matters.
I was just going to explain to listeners, and maybe you can explain it better, but there really are two branches of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Is that correct? There's the partners side, and then there's the ecological services side?
It's interesting because the Partners Private Lands program depends on which region you are. It's under either Ecological Services umbrella or the National Wildlife Refuge System. So it's interesting how it is managed across the nation. It's different from region to region.
So just for clarification, though, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife side of the service really works with voluntary conservation with private landowners. The ecological services side deals with the regulatory aspects. Do I have that right?
Yes, in general, people think about ecological services only as endangered species, but it has many other programs. Like I mentioned, the coastal restoration program and habitat conservation and other components, but it's mostly known because of the regulatory aspects of the program through the Endangered Species Act.
Great, thank you. I think that's helpful for people to sort of understand the different aspects of what the Fish and Wildlife Service does. So I apologize, I interrupted as you were talking about, what happened then after the BP spill.
Yeah, so I became acting assistant regional director for ecological services. It was funny because I didn't want that position. It was vacant, so I was just helping there. And I wanted to go back to Chesapeake Bay, but the regional director at the time, Cindy Donner, one day she came into my office and put some paperwork on my desk. And I said, well, what did I do? Did I get in trouble? Because she didn't say a word. Finally, she said, well, I'm advertising the assistant director position, and I hope that you apply. And then I look at her and I ask her, do I have a choice? And she just smiled, turned around and left. And for those of you that know Cindy Donner, She retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service, but she's an awesome person. And when she gets something in her head, she will make sure that she get it done. So I did apply, and from detailee, doing just helping the region, I joke, I became a detainee. So I became the actual assistant regional director under Cindy. And I did that until 2018. After she retired, I applied for the regional director position and got it. And I did that until I retired at the end of 2022. So it's been a very interesting career, that's for sure.
Okay, so during Cindy's tenure and then yours, you all accomplished some pretty remarkable things down there. And we at Western Landowners Alliance have been tracking that for quite some time. In fact, I first got introduced to it when we were participating in a Western Governors Association initiative on the Endangered Species Act. And we saw a webinar about the partnerships that you all had formed down there with landowners and state agencies and the Department of Defense to do some pretty significant conservation together. And that's really what drew me into being part initially of this conservation without conflict, but really seeing that as a model that hopefully we'll be able to scale out. And I know that that's the work that you're doing specifically at Conservation Without Conflict. So could you maybe talk about what did you guys do that was different than business as usual, and how did it evolve to the point where you are today?
One of the main reasons I came down and applied for those jobs and all of that is because the Southeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service was doing so well in terms of partnering with different sectors: agriculture, ranching, timber, energy, and actually getting things done. So that was very exciting. And the reason for that actually goes back to former regional director, that rest in peace, Sam Hamilton. He was a champion of partnering with anybody that will partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service and get conservation done. At the time, many issues. This is 1990s or 80s and 90s. He basically got tired of fighting in every front as an agency and all of that. And there were some issues with manatees and red-cockaded woodpeckers and Florida panthers and you name it. And everybody was fighting everybody. And he said, well, it's time to put a stop at that, and starting with the states. So the Fish and Wildlife Service and the states didn't get along very well at the time. And he established a doctrine that it was basically, I'm paraphrasing here, no daylight between us, meaning the Fish and Wildlife Service and the state wildlife agencies. Even when you disagreed on something, there was no daylight between them. And that actually grew to basically work with any partner, private or public. And Sam Hamilton became director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, but unfortunately he passed away early in his tenure. And Cindy Donner became the regional director, and she took that on and expanded it to many other partners. And then I did the same as regional director. But the key to success basically was open communications and basically trying to understand each other and building trust across the board between individuals, between organizations. They didn't matter if it was local, state, or federal government, just get along with people, establish a network, and build trust. That's basically the philosophy in the Southeast.
Tell us a little bit about what that actually looks like when it plays out on the ground. What does it mean to build trust between, say, a regulatory agency and landowners? I mean, you've got species that are being either petitioned or being listed for federal protection. This can have consequences to landowners, for example, in the region. So when you talk about building trust, what does that actually look like? How does that end up solving some of the conflict issues?
Couple of things there. One is from an agency perspective, is being transparent in how the process works. And transparency meaning, letting the public know what are the steps, what are the goals, what are the actual rules of engagement, and not leaving the proverbial black box out there that people don't know how decisions are made. So that's one. Is as an agency, we were as transparent as the law will allow with anybody, states and private landowners, with NGOs, you name it. Then the other big part was, and still is, getting to know each other as people, not just dealing with the business side of the equation, but going out, the Fish and Wildlife Service folks going out and learning about ranching or agriculture or forestry, and actually walking a mile in their boots and understanding that. And then on the same way, talking with those landowners and those industry leaders on how the internal Fish and Wildlife Service process works and what to expect. That's the third leg of that stool. It's managing expectations. Basically, again, going back to transparency. Say, hey, this is how it works. This is what you might expect through the process. If you have a problem with it at any stage, just give me a call. Let's not just communicate through letters and emails and things like that. Let's just talk if we had a disagreement. And so that was the building trust part. Our goal was to, and still is in the Fish and Wildlife Service, to actually build that trust. So if we had a problem, just grab the phone and talk instead of butting heads out there.
Right. So I think the National Alliance of Forest Owners became sort of one of those essential partners in the region, among others, as I understand it. I remember hearing about this agreement that was made about sharing data. Could they have enough trust to be able to share that data and not be penalized, and together perhaps find ways to conserve species while continuing to do their operations to keep them in business? Can you talk a little bit about that agreement and the regulatory assurances that you were able to put together? I'm thinking of things like the gopher tortoise and than other species, and maybe perhaps you could talk about sort of the difference in what happened with the black bear or the red cockaded woodpeckers versus what's happened in other parts of the country. So how it actually looked different on the ground for the landowners.
Oh wow, yeah. So I hope that we have like 8 hours to talk about that.
Yeah, we could do it in a bit of a nutshell, but I
Yeah.
think it's a fascinating story, and I think it contains a nugget of what really could be scaled out to other parts of the country.
No, and thank you for that. And you mentioned the NAFO, National Alliance Forest Owners. These are all the, I call them the big timber companies, Georgia Pacifics, Resource Management Services, Weyerhaeuser, that type of company and that association. Let me take you back to about 2010, 2011, and 2012. So during that time, the Fish and Wildlife Service got hit by multiple lawsuits, as well as what people called a mega petition to list over 400 species under the Endangered Species Act. Later, other smaller petitions came about during that time period. So one of the largest landowners in the Southeast is the forestry industry landowners. Collectively, those NAFO members, I believe they own about 22, 24 million acres in the Southeast. So, and a lot of species actually depend on those acres. So they actually kind of freak out, and no blame on them, about all of these mega petitions and lawsuits to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they said, hey, we need to do something different here and hopefully talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And if we show them what kind of conservation measures, best management practices, and things like that they do, maybe the Fish and Wildlife Service will not list many of these species. However, at the time, the level of trust between forestry industry and the Fish and Wildlife Service was not that high. But because of the relationships of Cindy Donner, leaders like Jimmy Bullock, and many others, we were able to actually get together in Atlanta at the Fish and Wildlife Service regional office We got some of the top managers of these companies, CEOs and VPs, into one room. And we discussed openly what was the situation in terms of the lawsuits, petitions, all of that. And they discussed openly their concerns. But then we ended up, okay, what can we do together, the industry as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service, to implement as much conservation as possible on the ground so we may be able to preclude the need to list many of these species. And we agreed to actually be proactive and start doing that. Two main things was not only conservation on the ground, but most importantly, in many cases, was just information. Because at the time, the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't have any information on those private lands. And the forestry folks said, we have that information, but we don't trust that that information will remain protected as private landowners. So we got into an agreement to share information, but we said, well, the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't need point data. I don't need to know exactly where a record-cated woodpecker is or a flatwood salamander or a gopher tortoise is. I just need general population numbers to be able to analyze and make decisions on listing or not. So through the NAFO and also other organizations like Forest Landowners Association, they collected their private landowner information, summarize it through the organizations, the associations, and then those entities actually provided a summary of the data to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that way they were able to protect the individual landowner information, aggregated the information by, I believe, in some cases was by county, in other cases was by watershed, and provided that to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that helped the agency to make decisions on not listing many species just because they got real-time population data. The species that were supposed to be in bad shape, actually, by adding the new data, resulted that they were doing pretty well. And that's how those agreements came about. It was the Fish and Wildlife Service with the associations and getting the data. That way, the private landowners were one step removed from the data exchange. And then the last thing that the agency and the landowners and through their associations did was collect all the best management practices that they were already implementing and that were certified by other organizations, third-party certifications on forestry practices. And Fish and Wildlife Service was able then to use those best management practices and third-party approval to use it through the decision-making process, analyze it, and said, hey, these best management practices being implemented are good enough to conserve the species on those lands. Therefore, the threats to the species were not as high as previously thought, and many species were precluded to be listed or were listed as threatened species instead of endangered species. So that was a win-win situation. It took a few years to develop, but I think the model can be definitely expanded and scaled to other areas across the nation.
And as I understand it, that's a lot of the work that you're doing with Conservation Without Conflict right now. Can you talk about how that organization came to be and what your mission is?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're exactly right. That's now what we're trying to promote through Conservation Without Conflict. So the organization, how it started was probably around 2016, 2017. A lot of those same large landowners, forestry, and the military. So also the Department of Defense, we did the exact same thing with the Department of Defense because a lot of species depend on their lands. So around 2016, 2017, especially out west, they start asking, hey, can we do the same here in our lands in, let's say, Oregon and Western states? And they were asking, well, what is the secret sauce that you guys in the Southeast are using? And everybody started talking about what we just talked, trust, relationships, all of that. But a group of leaders got together and say, hey, let's try to actually organize and have some organization that can actually advocate for that secret sauce, which is simple again, it's based on trust. So in 2017 or maybe early 18, we had a meeting at the Fish and Wildlife Service regional office again with a lot of partners, not only forestry, but also we had agencies like the NRCS, Department of Defense, Boone and Crockett Club, energy companies like Duke Energy, Southern Company, you name it. I think that we had probably 50 to 60 people representing different organizations, private and public. And basically we talk about what was that secret sauce. We put it in writing. And then one of the action items out of that meeting was, hey, let's organize a non-governmental organization, NGO, to put this together and have this philosophy expanded throughout the nation. And that's how the Wildlife Management Institute put up their hand and said, well, we'll host the organization if needed and provide all the admin support. And that's how Conservation Without Conflict actually became an organization. So, in a coalition of partners trying to implement conservation using common sense. That's my 5-second pitch. And easier said than done.
The Online Podcast is produced by the Western Landowners Alliance. In tumultuous times, we are the steady voice of landowners and land managers, helping policymakers chart a course for a whole and healthy West. Your gift helps make that voice louder. Give now at westernlandowners.org/support.
Well, it's great work. And I think if you can scale out the successes that we've seen there in the Southeast and increasingly in other regions around the country that demonstrate that, partnership rather than conflict is a better path to better outcomes for species, as well as for the landowners and the other land users in these landscapes. I think that's exciting and important work. And it actually segues into the next area I want to visit with you about today. And it's really about the ESA itself. And it sort of begs, why is all of this necessary in the wake of this particular law? So the ESA was passed in the early 1970s with bipartisan support. And yet it has become really controversial today. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on, first off, why it's become so controversial. And then the second, maybe as part of that, is there are really widely varying opinions about whether it's been successful. So you have wildlife advocates pointing to the fact that it's been largely very effective at preventing many species, such as bald eagles, from going extinct. But then you have critics of the ESA pointing to the fact that 1,700 species have been listed as threatened or endangered, not counting experimental populations, and yet only 3% of the listed species have ever been classified as recovered and subsequently delisted. So widely varying opinions on the success of the ESA, a lot of controversy around it that has emerged since those early bipartisan days. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Like, has the ESA been as effective as Congress had intended? And why has it become so controversial?
Wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, there is a lot to the whole thing.
Yeah. No, so yeah, you're right. 1973, that's when it was finalized and signed by President Nixon. And he had very strong support from reds and blues, Democrats and Republicans. And it was a result of the 1960s social issues and environmental issues, rivers catching on fire and all of that stuff. At the same time, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, and Clean Air Act were passed around the same time. So it was an interesting time back then in terms of all of these big environmental laws that were approved in a bipartisan way, which is amazing. in general, I think the Endangered Species Act has been good, very successful, but it can be way better than what it is. Obviously, preventing extinctions is an argument that has been used. Some people criticize that, others celebrate that, as you mentioned, which is fine. But I think one of the biggest areas of controversy is not the actual language or text of the law. It's mostly how it has been managed during the first 50, now 52, 53 years of that law. The implementation of it could be way better. Let me put it that way. And you talk about the Southeast region of the Fish and Wildlife Service, how they approach the Endangered Species Act management and administration versus other regions in the country that are more strict and rely more on the regulatory hammer than the carrot part. One thing that my good friend and conservation leader Jimmy Bullock will say, and this is probably the philosophy in the Southeast and how and why it has been so successful, is that if the law, in this case the Endangered Species Act, does not prohibit something, it means that you can do it. If the law is not explicit saying you cannot do this, like for example, you cannot go and intentionally kill protected species, and anybody doing that on purpose will receive the punishment under the law. But if the law doesn't prohibit you from doing this or that management practice, then there's flexibility there and you can get to an agreement. Obviously, that law was written in 1973 and a few amendments in the 1980s, 1982, the addition of the Section 10J, that's the non-essential experimental populations, and things like that have occurred through the years. For the most part, some things that can be enhanced or modified based on what we know now after 50 plus years of administering the act. There could be some improvement there. Not only in the law, but also, and probably easier to do, is the regulatory framework. The agency, in this case, Fish and Wildlife Service, can modify some of their policies and regulations to increase the level of flexibility in implementing the Endangered Species Act, especially when it's dealing with private landowners.
So I have a question about that. I think that one of the conundrums that the ESA presents for landowners is this sort of unintended consequence that if you're the one that's got a bunch of species or habitat on your property, you're the one that's most likely to be subjected to environmental regulation that could potentially really hurt your business. If you're a timber company or you're a livestock producer, energy producer, and you're the one that's done the good job stewarding things, that means you have the habitat, you have the species, and then the law may really becomes punitive. And that's been a great frustration. And I know that the service has developed tools like regulatory assurances like safe harbor, candidate conservation with assurances agreements that are now bundled under conservation benefit agreements. There's habitat conservation plans. And so there's some regulatory assurances that are available to landowners, but they seem to be pretty difficult for landowners to access. We did an experiment over the last 5 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service here in the Southern Rockies to see if we could make just one programmatic regulatory assurance agreement available to landowners there who want to restore streams and riparian areas where there are a number of threatened and endangered species. And after 5 years of trying, we finally all gave up because there were challenges inside the service with capacity. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainties, differences of knowledge. Anyway, it's a frustrating exercise. I can attest firsthand. So what could we do to fix this challenge that can be a real disincentive? And when I talk to people and explain the landowner perspective on the Endangered Species Act, first off, there are many diverse perspectives within the landowner community. Many landowners actually very much support the Endangered Species Act itself, but most landowners, if not all, really do support the conservation of wildlife. We like wildlife. We want to take care of wildlife. So why then do you so often hear landowner groups in opposition to the ESA are asking for reform. Well, it comes back down to this challenge that can be punitive, and there are aspects of the act itself, and then also its implementation that can be punitive. So I think that's why what you all did in the Southeast was so interesting, because it showed a path forward that could get around that. And yet it's really hard to do. It's been hard to scale out to other regions. Hopefully we'll continue to see progress there. And in the meantime, are there statutory improvements or are there regulatory improvements that could be made? And a number of them are being proposed right now. Whether they're, going to be the solution or not, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what might need to change, for instance, in statute. I'll just say one more thing. A lot of people that really care about conserving threatened and endangered species are very concerned about whether opening the act for modification, even if it's to improve it, is a good thing right now in such a divided Congress. And so it makes people nervous to even talk about that. But in an ideal world, if you had bipartisanship and you had support for conservation and the intent is to improve things, what would you do?
That's a great question. And I'll go back to something you mentioned. It's the fear of the regulatory hammer and being punished because you actually did the right things and have the species on your land. I think that internally, both agencies that manage the Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife Service, obviously, is the big one here on terrestrial, but National Marine Fisheries Service is the manager in ocean environment. My own opinion and Conservation Without Conflicts opinion is that we should make listed species and at-risk species an asset instead of a liability to those private landowners. Those species are there because whatever the landowner is doing is right. That's why the species is still there. So let's flip the entire model and actually learn, instead of what the landowners cannot do, let's explore why or what are they doing that the species are still there, and learn from that and expand that. So making those species an asset is critical. I'm a landowner myself here, as you mentioned, in Southwest Georgia. I have several hundred acres here managed for timber. I have relocated woodpeckers just across the boundary with Fort Benning, and I have gopher tortoises and many other species. So why should I be punished and limited in the way I manage my land if those species are happy here? They're here for a reason. I'm doing something right. So let's learn from that kind of situation and then apply it and expand it. In terms of the political environment right now, and there's a lot of fears of opening up the Endangered Species Act, that's for sure, because of all the political divide and controversies all the time. I don't know where those efforts will end up, but for example, one thing that I've been talking about for many, many years is very simple tweak of the Endangered Species Act is critical habitat. Critical habitat, for example, only applies to federal actions, but when you see a map and your land is within a polygon of critical habitat, as a landowner, I'll freak out. I say, why I'm under a line on a map that says it's critical habitat, even though as a landowner, it doesn't apply to me unless I get federal money or something. That tool, for example, should be probably used for recovery. So instead of the regulatory side. So if I was king for a day, that's one thing I will try to fix. But in terms of the current efforts, I don't have an opinion on what is good or bad or anything like that. But I think that we can work through the regulatory process because I believe there's a lot of flexibility already in the Endangered Species Act. The problem is how it has been implemented. So there's not, in my opinion, not a lot of issues with the act itself, but how the regulatory framework has been developed through the years and the practices. So I'll stop there because I know that you had other areas that I just forgot the entire question.
No problem. It's a really big question. The challenge is the Endangered Species Act is well intended, but it sets up some of these unintended consequences. And that has led to quite a lot of conflict and real challenge for landowners who, they say up to 80% of wildlife species, including T&E species, are dependent on private lands for survival. And so engaging private landowners in helping conserve and recover these species is absolutely going to be crucial to the survival of the species. But you can't force landowners to do good things for species by threatening to put them out of business. At the end of the day, that's really where the rub is. And I think that's what you're seeing there, what you all have done in the Southeast, what you're doing through Conservation Without Conflict. Certainly what Western Landowners Alliance is trying to do is find a way forward that's beneficial to more success for wildlife, and also to keep these working lands, these private lands that are the critical habitat base for both people and wildlife, intact and healthy going forward. And landowners need support rather than punitive measures to be able to make that successful. And that's the pivot that seems to need to happen. And when you see partnership efforts like you're leading, it's really exciting. The challenge, and I think this is where a lot of the efforts in Congress and in the administration currently come in, is that you have what some people call serial litigation. You have some environmental groups whose basic model of doing business, their model of operation is litigation. And some people call it the weaponization of the Endangered Species Act. And those groups tend not to be at that collaborative table. And so you've got situations where people are working toward collaborative solutions and maybe even seeing great successes, but nevertheless either, face the litigation or have that constant fear of litigation. And we see that the federal agencies become risk averse to trying innovative things because of this threat of litigation. And how to handle that has been one of the great questions that comes up constantly, because you want to protect the ability of different organizations to litigate. There are valid reasons for litigation. And yet you also want to somehow not have that threat be constantly undermining what may be much better outcomes in the long run. How do we address that? Is that a statutory fix? Is that a regulatory fix?
Lowell Bear, he wrote a book a few years back. It's called Equal Access to Justice Act. And that's the act, as I understand it. It talks about reimbursing, and the congressional intent was to reimburse veterans when they sued the government and they won the case. The government should reimburse them. There's a lot of details there that I'm not an attorney, so I cannot explain. But basically, that Equal Access to Justice Act is the law that has been used to get a lot of environmental groups to be reimbursed. They file a lawsuit and either settle or won the lawsuit. They get reimbursed for their attorney fees and all of those things. So if anybody wants to explore that, that might be an option there. Again, I'm not an attorney. That's one thing. In terms of the ESA text, there's not much there that can be done. If the government is doing something completely wrong, obviously citizens can file lawsuits and things like that. But the business model in many organizations is exactly what you described, unfortunately. I rather put all of those resources, instead of going to litigation, they should go to actual conservation and actually recover species with those funds that are being used to litigate. It's in the hundreds of millions of dollars probably. And imagine if we can use those funds, public and private, just to do conservation on the ground, we will have a lot less species listed under the Endangered Species Act. That's my bet.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think sort of my last question here is right along those lines, which is when we went through the process with the Western Governors Association, it was a 3-year initiative, which was, by the way, just a terrific, well done piece of work with many diverse stakeholders at the table. We benefited a lot from just learning through that process from all the different perspectives there. But the consensus coming out of that was that we really need to get ahead of the curve and sort of out of the emergency room with species conservation. We need to be conserving species before they become imperiled and not just working at the 11th hour to prevent extinction. And most of that really comes down to habitat and the quality and availability of habitat and the stewardship of that habitat, which comes back to the private landowners, because most of that habitat is on private lands. And so the question really becomes, how do we support landowners in conserving these habitats and the species that need them? So often, we see investment into the regulatory side of this in the agencies and much less investment into the proactive side, particularly in the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Partners for Fish and Wildlife program has been enormously popular with landowners. That is the proactive voluntary conservation work that the service has done, and it's been rated over and over as just a top program by landowners. But it's not as well funded as other aspects. What would we need to do to increase the proactive voluntary work with landowners within Fish and Wildlife Service? Are there things in the appropriation side that Congress could do? Are there ways that we could add more capacity? I mean, we're at a time of cutting back federal agencies. So what would need to happen right now to direct that support in that way?
No, good question there. And I think that one of the biggest problems that I saw while I was with the agency is all the programmatic silos. Basically, within the Fish and Wildlife Service, you have a bunch of smaller programs like we mentioned earlier, ecological services, National Wildlife Refuge System, migratory birds, and everybody working individually. That's one of the big reasons we have all of these controversies. However, if we erase those programmatic silos within the agency, we actually can find even more flexibilities for the Endangered Species Act. One great example is the use of the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program to manage and reintroduce listed species onto private lands. We just did that recently with Resource Management Services, one of the forestry companies that we work with, and a very important member of the Conservation Without Conflict Coalition. They actually did a project in Florida to reintroduce the reticulated flatwoods salamander, a threatened species, onto their lands. And they restore the habitats and manage it now for that species. And that was done through an agreement using the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. I mentioned that because that's the very first time that has been done. The whole process took just months, and the landowner actually received very similar, if not better, assurances compared to those through the Safe Harbor program or Candidate Conservation Agreement program. But it took many, many years to actually get the agency to change their point of view and actually accomplish that. We can go deep into that, but there are different sections of the Endangered Species Act that were used in here. But my point is that if we can use other authorities within the federal government, not just the Endangered Species Act, there's plenty of resources that can be managed to help landowners, to help the species on their lands to be more secure, to be more sustainable, and eventually have both landowner success in terms of their economy and also recover species to a point where they no longer need the protections of the ESA. So I think that there's a lot of resources in terms of authorities and even funding. There's a lot of money still out there, even with all the proposed cuts, that can be redirected to promote conservation on private lands without punishing landowners for doing the right thing.
Yeah, that would be a sea change, really. I think it'd be a sea change in conservation when we get to that point. It seems to me that what we really want to be doing is focusing on and celebrating the recovery, the conservation and recovery of species, rather than being in a space where, for many environmental proponents, advocates, getting a species federally listed and keeping it federally listed through litigation is a victory. But from our standpoint, the real victory is getting those species recovered. If you have to list a species under federal protection, that represents a failure in the beginning to have conserved the species. And if you are keeping species listed, that represents in many ways a continued failure. So if we can reinvest in the partnerships, the financial investments, public and private financial investments to get those species actually to recovery, and then to conserve species before they need to even be considered for that. That would seem to me to be the real victory. And as you said, if we could pivot those hundreds of millions of dollars from the litigation into the actual habitat conservation, we'd probably, and species would probably be far ahead. So, Leo, thank you. You've given us a lot of time this morning. I really appreciate it. This is a difficult, fraught, challenging issue, and I'm just so appreciative of your leadership and Conservation Without Conflict and all of the folks that have brought us to this approach that is really unfolding in a positive way. So thank you for all you've done.
Thank you, Leslie. And I think that, again, if we can get to the point where we can make at-risk enlisted species an asset, we can keep them out of the emergency room and have really good, sustainable communities, keeping working lands working and conserving those species. That's right on. Thank you for the invite, and glad to be able to have a chat with you today.
Same back. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Leo for joining us today. You can learn more about Conservation Without Conflict and Leo's work in the show notes, which you can find by heading over to onland.link/podcast. On Land is a production of Western Landowners Alliance, a West-wide organization of landowners, natural resource managers, and partners dedicated to keeping working lands whole and healthy for the benefit of people and wildlife. This episode was hosted by Lesli Allison and produced by Zach Altman with support from Kathleen Shannon. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.